The scent of roasting garlic and rosemary filled the kitchen of our Lincoln Park Greystone. A varm, domestic perfume that usually brought me peace. I was 46. A lead archivist at a downtown Chicago museum. A woman whose entire career was built on preserving the past. I didn't know it yet. But my husband of 22 years was actively trying to erase my future. It was a Tuesday afternoon. I was preparing a heavy pre-game pasta dish for my 16-year-old son, Leo, who had a crucial lacrosse tournament that evening. My husband, Mark, a 52-year-old commercial property developer, whose charm was as polished as his Italian leather shoes, was supposedly downtown, closing a routine lease agreement. The rain drummed a steady, comforting rhythm against the bay windows. Then, my tablet chimed from the kitchen island. It was a notification from my personal email. Wiping olive oil from my hands onto a dish towel, I tapped the screen. The subject line read, "Confirmation required. Title transfer documentation, 440, 2W, Arlington Place." I stared at the address. It was our address. Frowning, I opened the message. It was sent from a boutique wheel, TH Management, an escrow firm I didn't recognize. The body of the email was brief, professional, and entirely terrifying. Dear Mrs. Breft Jenkins, please be advised that the transfer of ownership will be finalized immediately upon receipt of your physically signed consent forms. We have attached the digital copies for your review. Please let us know if your husband, Mr. Jenkins, or your associate, Ms. Victoria Vance, requires further documentation. Victoria Vance. The name echoed in my mind. She was a 44-year-old boutique hotel investor. A wealthy client Mark had mentioned frequently over the past 8 months. He always spoke of her with a mix of professional reverence and mild exhaustion, claiming her demands for a new commercial property were running him ragged. Mark had explicitly told me our Greystone, the house we had spent 15 years restoring, the house where our daughter, Chloe, had taken her first steps before leaving for college, was completely unencumbered and uninvolved in his current business maneuverings. My heart began a slow, heavy pounding against my ribs. But my archivist instincts took over. Panic is the enemy of preservation. I didn't call Mark. Instead, I carefully typed a reply to the sender. Thank you for the update. Could you please send over the physical copy of the document that Mark mentioned I had already signed? I need to verify a detail for my records. 10 minutes later, a PDF arrived in my inbox. I opened it. At the bottom of a heavily redacted transfer agreement was my signature. The loops and the sharp crossing of the T, my maiden name, were perfectly replicated, but I knew, with the absolute certainty of a woman who documents history for a living, that I had never signed that piece of paper. I set the tablet down. The kitchen suddenly felt very cold. He wasn't just planning to leave me. He had already begun selling my life while I was still living in it. The next evening, Mark walked through the front door, shaking the spring rain from his umbrella. He kissed my cheek, asked about Leo's lacrosse game, and poured himself a glass of Pinot Noir. He was relaxed, expansive, playing the role of the tired but devoted patriarch to absolute perfection. I have to show properties to the Vance Group this weekend, he sighed, loosening his tie. It's going to eat up my entire Saturday. I'm sorry, Sarah. I stirred my tea, watching his reflection in the dark kitchen window. That's all right, I said evenly. Actually, I was looking at the kitchen today. The cabinetry is getting a bit worn. I was thinking about doing a full remodel next spring. We're going to be in this house for at least another 10 years. Right? Might as well make it perfect. Mark's hand froze halfway to his mouth. The wine glass trembled slightly. When he lowered it, his jaw was tight, his eyes flashing with a sudden, disproportionate irritation. A remodel, Sarah? That's absurd, he snapped, his voice adopting a patronizing edge I hadn't heard in years. The market is volatile. Tying up liquid capital in cosmetic house renovations right now is incredibly short-sighted. We need to be agile, not anchored. He caught himself, smoothing his expression back into an easy smile. But the crack in the facade had been glaring. Let's just hold off on any big projects. Okay. Honey? Of course, I murmured, taking a sip of my tea. The following Saturday, I told Mark I was driving down to Peoria to visit my mother for the weekend, taking Leo with me so he could help his grandmother with some yard work. I packed the car, kissed Mark goodbye, and drove away. But I didn't go to Peoria. I dropped Leo off at my sister's house in the suburbs and drove back to Chicago, parking my sedan 3 blocks away from my own home. I pulled up my jacket collar, put on a pair of sunglasses, and walked back toward Arlington Place, feeling like a stranger in my own neighborhood. At 1 p.m., a sleek black town car pulled up to my house. Mark stepped out the front door, wearing his best-tailored suit. A moment later, a woman emerged from the town car. She was striking, dressed in a sharp camel coat and designer heels Victoria Vance. They weren't alone. A man in a high-vis vest carrying a tripod and a laser measuring device joined them. A surveyor. I hid behind the sprawling oak tree across the street, my hands shaking as I pulled out my phone. I zoomed in and began snapping photos. I documented the license plate of the town car, the surveyor's company logo on his jacket, and the way Mark placed a proprietary hand on the small of Victoria's back as he ushered her into my home. He was gesturing to the architecture, pointing out the bay windows, presenting the property as if he had already stripped my ghost from its walls. I didn't storm across the street. I didn't scream. I quietly turned around and walked back to my car, the cold reality settling in my bones. I thought I was investigating an affair. In reality, I was investigating a plot to erase me from my own life. My sister, Rachel, is a forensic auditor. Where I preserve history, Rachel dissects it, tearing apart ledgers to find the lies hidden in the margins. On Monday morning, I sat in her sterile, glass-walled office in the Loop, sliding my tablet across her desk. Find everything, I told her, my voice hollow. It took Rachel less than 48 hours to untangle the web Mark had woven. When I returned to her office, she looked physically ill. Sarah, she began softly, turning her monitor toward me. It's worse than another woman. She walked me through the nightmare. 8 months ago, Mark had quietly taken out a massive second mortgage on our home, forging my signature on the electronic documents. He had opened a shadow investment account in my name, funneling the funds through it to make it look like I was an active participant. The money didn't stay there long, and was systematically wired into an LLC controlled by Victoria Vance. He's over-leveraged, Rachel explained, pointing to a labyrinth of red numbers. His commercial projects are underwater. He's using your home as collateral to buy into Victoria's hotel development. And it gets worse. She clicked to a new document. He filed a preliminary declaration of separation in a county 3 hours from here. He claimed you two have been living apart for a year. Furthermore, I found a luxury condo lease in River North. It's co-signed by Mark Jenkins and Victoria Vance. I felt the oxygen leave the room. He wasn't just having an affair, he was building an entirely parallel existence, funded by the dismantling of mine. But how is he getting away with selling our primary residence? I asked, my voice barely a whisper. The title company needs my physical presence. My notarized consent. Rachel's face hardened. She handed me a printed file folder. This was tucked into the loan addendums. I opened the folder. It was a medical evaluation from a private psychiatrist I had never met. The report detailed an extensive history of severe emotional instability, cognitive decline, and chronic paranoia. It concluded that I, Sarah Jenkins, was no longer mentally fit to manage my financial affairs. I stared at the words, a sickening dread washing over me. Mark was laying the legal groundwork to claim power of attorney. He was going to argue that my forged signature was a necessary act of a loving husband protecting his incapacitated wife. That afternoon, Rachel took me to see Diana Sterling, one of the most ruthless family and estate attorneys in Chicago. Diana listened to my story without blinking, tapping a gold pen against her mahogany desk. Your husband is a sociopath, Mrs. Jenkins, Diana said plainly. And he is currently holding all the cards. We need to freeze the assets. But if we alert him now, he will destroy the digital trail and accelerate the sale. For now, you have strict rules of engagement. She leaned forward. Rule 1. Do not sign anything. Rule 2. Do not leave that house overnight again. Rule 3. Do not let him provoke you. He is trying to build a case that you are mentally unstable. If you yell, if you cry, if you throw a plate, he will record it and use it against you in front of a judge. You must be stone. I nodded, gripping the arms of my chair. But the hardest rule to follow wouldn't be keeping quiet. It would be surviving the psychological trap he was building around my mind. When I returned home, the true psychological warfare began. Mark transitioned seamlessly into the role of the deeply concerned, long-suffering caregiver. It started with small things. He would bring me breakfast in bed, looking at me with eyes full of manufactured pity. You look so tired. Sarah, are you sure you're sleeping? You've been pacing the halls at night? I hadn't been pacing at all. He escalated his tactics during dinner one night, with our son Leo sitting between us. Sarah, did you pay the water bill like we discussed? Mark asked gently, cutting his steak. We didn't discuss the water bill, Mark, I replied, keeping my voice perfectly level. It's on autopay. Mark exchanged a look with Leo, a look of tragic, shared burden. Honey, we talked about this on Tuesday. You really don't remember? You've been so forgetful lately. Maybe you should take a leave of absence from the museum. The stress is clearly getting to you. I am fine. Mark? I said, my heart hammering against my ribs. The next day, a calendar notification popped up on my phone. Mark had booked a consultation for me with a neurologist. I was suffocating in my own home. But the most devastating blow came from my son. Later that week, I found Leo in his room, staring blankly at his homework. I sat on the edge of his bed, desperately needing an ally. Leo, I started carefully. Have you noticed your dad acting strange lately? He's been saying things that aren't true, doing things behind my back. Leo Sahil, rubbing his face in a gesture that looked exactly like his father's. Mom, stop. Dad told me you were getting paranoid. He said the doctor thinks you're having early onset cognitive issues. Leo, that's a lie. He's manipulating us. He's trying to help you, Leo snapped, turning to face me, his eyes full of teenage frustration and genuine fear. You're constantly stressed. You're sneaking around. Dad is holding everything together. Why can't you just let him help you? Tears pricked my eyes, but I forced them back. Mark had poisoned my son against me. He was isolating me, stripping away my credibility piece by piece. That night, knowing I was losing ground, I logged into my home computer to check the hidden folder where I had backed up the misdirected email and the forged documents. The folder was empty. My stomach dropped. I checked the trash bin. The cloud server, scrubbed clean. I heard footsteps behind me and turned to see Mark leaning against the doorframe, sipping a glass of bourbon, looking for something. "Sweetheart?" he asked, his voice smooth as silk. "You know, I noticed you opened one of my confidential work emails last week. Did you get confused again? I didn't open your work email." "Mark," I said, staring directly into his eyes. He smiled. A cold, empty expression. "Of course you did, Sarah. Who else would have? Your memory is just slipping. It's okay. I'm here to take care of everything." We stared at each other in the dim light of the study. We both knew it was a lie. And we both knew he thought he had won. I was prepared to fight my husband. But I wasn't prepared for the next move to come from the enemy camp. The phone call came 2 days later while I was cataloging an exhibit at the museum. It was an unknown number. "Sarah Jenkins," a sharp, clipped female voice asked. "Speaking. This is Victoria Vance." The air left my lungs. I gripped the edge of my desk, remembering Diana's rule. "Do not engage. I don't think we have anything to discuss." "Ms. Vance, don't hang up," she said quickly, her usual polished tone laced with frantic anger. "Mark told me you were heavily medicated, undergoing psychiatric care, and had gladly agreed to the divorce and the sale of the house. He said the property was solely in his name. Is any of that true?" I paused, my mind racing. "None of it is true." A heavy silence fell over the line. Then, Victoria exhaled a sharp, bitter laugh. "That son of a bitch." We met an hour later at an upscale, dimly lit cocktail lounge in the Gold Coast. Victoria was not a cartoon villain. She was a ruthless businesswoman who had just realized she was being conned. She ordered a dry martini and laid a manila envelope on the table between us. "I don't like you, and I assume you despise me," Victoria said smoothly, taking a sip of her drink. "But I despise being made a fool of even more. Mark didn't just lie to me about your mental state." She pushed the envelope toward me. "He promised the Lincoln Park house to my investment group as collateral. I just found out yesterday that he also leveraged it to a Chinese private equity firm. He sold the same ghost twice to cover his massive debts. If this deal goes south, my firm takes a multi-million-dollar hit." I opened the envelope. Inside were printouts of emails, wire transfers, and a small USB drive. "I record all my business meetings," Victoria stated, her eyes flashing with cold fury. "Track 3 on that drive is a conversation Mark and I had in my car last week. You'll want to hear it." I plugged the drive into my laptop right there in the booth. I put in my headphones and clicked play. Amidst the hum of road noise, I heard Mark's voice, arrogant and relaxed. "Victoria, the title company is getting antsy. Mark, we need Sarah's physical signature on the final release, or they won't fund the escrow. Mark, don't worry about Sarah. I'm laying the groundwork with a psychiatrist. By the time we close, everyone will be entirely convinced she's medically unfit to manage a checking account, let alone a real estate transaction. When people believe she's mentally unstable, the forged signature won't matter. I'll have emergency conservatorship. I can sign whatever I want." I pulled the headphones out, my hands trembling, though not from fear. The recording didn't just hold his betrayal, it held the exact weapon I needed to destroy him. Mark told me he had an all-day symposium downtown on Friday. I knew, thanks to Victoria, that he was actually attending the final closing meeting for the sale of my house at 1:45 p.m. I walked into the soaring glass lobby of the real estate brokerage firm. I wore a tailored charcoal suit, my hair pulled back into a severe, elegant twist. I looked exactly like what I was, a woman in complete control of her faculties. I took the elevator to the 40th floor. My sister Rachel was waiting for me in the hallway, standing next to my son, Leo. I had asked Rachel to pull him out of school. Leo looked confused and defensive. "Mom, what are we doing here?" Leo hissed. "Dad said you were at the doctor." "Just watch." "Leo," I said softly. "Just watch and listen." I pushed open the heavy oak doors of the executive conference room. The room was full. Sitting around a massive marble table were two executives from the private equity firm, a bewildered escrow attorney, the brokerage manager, Victoria Vance, and at the head of the table, Mark. Mark was mid-sentence. Benninghant, hovering over a thick stack of documents. When he looked up and saw me, the color drained from his face so fast he looked like a corpse. For 3 agonizing seconds, there was absolute silence. "Sarah," Mark stammered, scrambling to put his mask back on. He looked around the room, offering a condescending 79, sorrowful smile to the executives. "Gentlemen, I apologize. This is my wife. As I mentioned, she is suffering from a severe psychological episode. She shouldn't be here." He stood up, walking toward me with his hands raised like he was trying to calm a wild animal. "Come on, sweetheart. Let's get you back to the clinic." I didn't back away. I walked right past him and dropped a heavy leather binder onto the center of the marble table. "Good afternoon, gentlemen," I said, my voice clear and ringing with authority. "My name is Sarah Jenkins. I am the co-owner of the property at 442 W. Arlington Place. I am of perfectly sound mind, and I am here to inform you that the man sitting at the head of this table is attempting to commit massive wire fraud." The room erupted into quiet. Urgent murmure. The escrow attorney looked panicked. "She's having a delusion," Mark shouted, his composure shattering. "She doesn't know what she's saying. Her memory is gone." I opened the binder. "Document 1," I said, sliding a paper toward the attorney. "A forensic analysis of my forged signature on the second mortgage." Document 2. Bank statements showing unauthorized transfers from our joint accounts into an LLC controlled by Miss Vance. Victoria, playing her part flawlessly, picked up the paper and feigned shock. "And finally," I said, pulling out a small Bluetooth speaker from my purse, "an injunction filed an hour ago by my attorney, Deanna Sterling, freezing all assets related to this property. And this..." I hit play on my phone. Mark's voice filled the high-ceilinged room, echoing off the glass walls. "When people believe she's mentally unstable, the forged signature won't matter. I can sign whatever I want." The silence that followed was suffocating. The executives from the equity firm immediately began packing their briefcases. The escrow attorney pushed the closing documents violently away from himself, as if they were on fire. Mark was hyperventilating, his eyes darting around the room, desperate for an exit. He looked at the doorway and saw Leo standing there. His jaw dropped, tears pooling in his eyes. "Leo." Mark gasped, stumbling toward him. "Leo. Buddy. You know she's sick. You know she made this up. She deep-faked that audio. She's crazy. Leo stepped back, out of his father's reach. His teenage voice cracked, but his logic was razor sharp. "Dad," Leo said, his voice trembling with heartbreak and rage. "You told me Mom couldn't remember what day it was. You told me she couldn't remember signing the papers. So why did you say on that tape that you needed to make people believe it?" Mark opened his mouth, but no words came out. The brilliant, silver-tongued developer had finally talked himself into a corner he couldn't charm his way out of. The pen dropped from his hand, and with it, the facade he had spent 8 months building. There are no perfect victories in a war that takes place inside your own home. The fallout was catastrophic and swift. The real estate transaction was immediately terminated. The brokerage firm suspended Mark pending a federal investigation for bank and wire fraud. Victoria Vance extracted her capital and disappeared back into the corporate ether. Untainted, but thoroughly chastened. The divorce was brutal. I retained the Greystone in Lincoln Park, but I had to sell a significant portion of my retirement portfolio to untangle the financial mess Mark had left behind and to pay Diana Sterling's exorbitant, though entirely earned, legal fees. The deepest wounds, however, were not financial. Chloe, away at college, struggled with immense guilt, feeling that she should have noticed something was wrong during her visits home. Leo took it the hardest. He had been weaponized against his own mother, manipulated into doubting the woman who raised him. It took months of family therapy, tears, and long, quiet walks by Lake Michigan before the walls between us began to come down. He apologized to me, but I told him he had nothing to be sorry for. He was a boy who trusted his father. His father was the one who broke that trust. 6 months after the divorce was finalized, I stood in my kitchen. The aroma of roasting garlic and rosemary once again filled the air. Contractors were coming tomorrow to tear down the worn cabinetry. I was finally doing the kitchen remodel. I wasn't doing it to increase the property value or to prove a point to the ghost of my ex-husband. I was doing it because it was the first major decision I was making for a house that now belonged entirely, unquestionably, to me. As an archivist, I know that history is written by those who control the documents. Mark thought that if he could just forge my name on a piece of paper, he could rewrite my reality. He thought a signature was the only thing that proved a person's existence. He was wrong. Sometimes, existence isn't proven by ink on a page. Sometimes, it is proven by the moment you refuse to be erased. Step into the room and force the world to hear the truth.